Before we dive in, pause for a moment and tell me something. Where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Maybe it's sunrise in Nairobi, midnight in New York, afternoon in Canada, or evening in France. Don't just watch quietly. Drop a comment below and let's see how far this story reaches across the world. Now, lean in and let's begin. Evangeline Dufresne stared at the weathered wanted poster in her trembling hands, the face on the yellowed paper matching exactly the man she'd been sharing her table, her home, and her heart with for the past 3 weeks. Julien Blackwood, wanted dead or alive for the murder of 5 men including Sheriff Coleman of Bitter Creek. Reward, $2,000. The words blurred as tears filled her eyes, but the harsh reality remained clear as mountain air. The gentle stranger who'd chopped her firewood and mended her broken fence was a cold-blooded killer with a bounty on his head that could buy her entire ranch twice over. The poster had fallen from Julian's coat pocket while she was mending a tear in the fabric, an innocent act of kindness that had shattered every assumption she'd made about the mysterious man who'd stumbled onto her remote Wyoming homestead with bullet wounds and stories about being robbed by bandits. His lies had been so convincing, his gratitude so genuine, his presence so comforting after 2 years of crushing loneliness since her husband Thomas's death. She'd opened her home and heart to a stranger whose very existence made her an accessory to murder and a target for bounty hunters who wouldn't hesitate to kill anyone protecting their quarry. The kitchen where she stood felt smaller now, suffocating with the weight of deception that had been sitting at her table, eating the meals she'd cooked with such care and affection. Every shared conversation, every moment of growing closeness, every flutter of attraction she'd felt toward this soft-spoken man had been built on foundations of violence and lies that transformed her sanctuary into a trap. The coffee cup he'd used that morning still sat unwashed by the basin, a tangible reminder of how completely she'd been fooled by someone whose gentle demeanor concealed the soul of a killer. Through the window, she could see Julian splitting wood behind the barn with the methodical precision that had impressed her so much during his recovery. His movements were fluid and efficient, but now she recognized them as the actions of someone whose survival depended on constant physical readiness rather than simple hard work. The man she'd begun to love was practicing for violence while pretending to perform domestic chores, preparing his body for the next killing while accepting her care and affection like a wolf in sheep's clothing. The sound of his approaching footsteps on the porch steps sent panic through her chest as she quickly folded the wanted poster and slipped it into her apron pocket, her mind racing with impossible questions about what to do with knowledge that could destroy them both. Should she confront him with evidence of his crimes, run to town and collect the bounty that could secure her financial future, or pretend ignorance while sharing her home with a man whose past was written in other people's blood? As Julian's familiar knock echoed through the kitchen door, Evangeline realized that whatever choice she made in the next few seconds would determine whether she lived as a fool, died as a hero, or was damned as an accomplice to murder. 8 months before Julienne's arrival, Evangeline had buried her husband Thomas beside the apple tree he'd planted on their wedding day, watching dirt cover the coffin that contained her dreams of growing old with the only man she'd ever loved. The consumption had taken him slowly, giving them time to say goodbye, but also time to watch him waste away until he was barely a shadow of the strong rancher who'd carried her across the threshold of their modest cabin 5 years earlier. His death had left her with a struggling ranch, mounting debts, and isolation so complete it felt like being buried alive in the vast emptiness of the Wyoming territory. The ranch that had been a paradise when shared with Thomas became a prison when worked alone, each day stretching endlessly as she struggled with tasks that required 2 sets of hands and knowledge she'd never needed to acquire while he'd been alive to handle the business side of their operation. The cattle wandered through broken fences she couldn't repair properly, the barn roof leaked through shingles she couldn't replace safely, and the account books balanced with numbers that never seemed to add up to enough money to keep the operation solvent. Her husband's dream was dying as surely as he had, one failed task at a time. The neighbors who'd been friendly during Thomas's lifetime had gradually stopped visiting, their initial offers of help fading as their own responsibilities took precedence over charity for a woman whose independence made them uncomfortable. The few men who did call weren't interested in lending assistance. They came with proposals that would solve her financial problems by making her someone else's responsibility, marriages of convenience that would absorb her property into their holdings while reducing her to the status of housekeeper and occasional comfort. Their transparent motives made solitude preferable to company that came with such degrading conditions. The winter months had been the worst, with storms that lasted for days, leaving her completely cut off from any human contact while she rationed food and fuel that had to last until spring. The conversations she'd held with Thomas's photograph became longer and more detailed as the silence threatened to drive her mad. But even imaginary companionship couldn't fill the void left by his absence. She'd begun to understand why some frontier widows simply walked into blizzards rather than face another season of isolation that felt more like death than living. The arrival of spring had brought hope that proved false when the seasonal work revealed how much the ranch had deteriorated during the months when survival had taken precedence over maintenance. The financial situation was desperate, the physical demands overwhelming, and the emotional toll of continuing alone was becoming unbearable. When Julien had stumbled onto her property, bleeding and unconscious, part of her had seen him as an answer to prayers she'd been afraid to voice, not because she knew who he was, but because she was so desperate for human companionship that she would have nursed the devil back to health if it meant hearing another voice in her empty home. Julien's tale of being robbed and shot by bandits while traveling to California had seemed completely believable when he'd regained consciousness in Evangeline's spare bedroom, his pain and confusion so genuine that she'd never questioned the details that now seemed obviously fabricated. The wounds were real enough, a bullet graze across his ribs and another through his shoulder that had left him weak from blood loss and infection. But his explanation of being an innocent traveler targeted by random criminals now seemed like a carefully constructed lie designed to explain injuries that were probably the result of a gunfight with law enforcement or fellow outlaws. His gratitude during the weeks of recovery had been touching and apparently sincere, with quiet thanks for her care and offers to work off his debt to her through whatever labor he could manage despite his injuries. The chores he'd tackled with methodical efficiency had been exactly what the ranch needed. Fence repairs that would have taken her weeks, roof work that was beyond her physical capabilities, and livestock management that required strength and experience she didn't possess. His help had been so valuable that she'd begun to hope he might stay permanently, not as hired hand, but as partner in rebuilding what Thomas's death had left in ruins. The conversations they'd shared during long evenings by the fireplace had revealed a man of surprising intelligence and sensitivity, someone who could discuss literature and philosophy with equal comfort. His knowledge of distant places and different ways of life had suggested travel and education that went beyond what most frontier drifters possessed, while his questions about her own background and dreams had shown genuine interest in her as a person rather than simply as a woman whose household he was sharing. The connection between them had grown gradually but steadily, built on mutual respect and compatible temperaments. The physical attraction that had developed alongside their intellectual compatibility had been unexpected and powerful, catching Evangeline off guard after 2 years of believing herself incapable of feeling such things for anyone other than Thomas. Julien's gentle manner and respectful distance had made her feel safe, exploring emotions she'd thought were buried with her husband, while his obvious appreciation for her strength and intelligence had restored confidence that isolation had steadily eroded. The possibility of love had begun to seem like a gift rather than a betrayal of Thomas's memory. But now, Holding the wanted poster that revealed him as a killer rather than an innocent victim, every moment of growing intimacy felt like evidence of her own stupidity and dangerous naivety. The man whose touch had begun to awaken feelings she'd thought dead forever was wanted for multiple murders that proved his gentle demeanor was nothing more than practiced deception. The partner she'd begun to hope might help her rebuild her life was actually a threat to her safety, whose very presence put her in mortal danger from bounty hunters, lawmen, and anyone else seeking the substantial reward for his capture. As she watched him through the window, still unaware that she'd discovered his secret, Evangeline realized she was facing the most dangerous moment of her life, disguised as an ordinary afternoon on her quiet ranch. The weeks before Evangeline's discovery had been filled with moments of connection that had slowly rebuilt her capacity for happiness after months of grieving isolation. Julien's presence had transformed the oppressive silence of her empty home into something warm and welcoming, with conversations that ranged from practical ranch management to shared memories of books they'd both read and places they'd both seen in their different travels. His intelligence and gentleness had reminded her that companionship could exist without the condescension she'd experienced from other men who'd assumed her widowhood made her desperate for male guidance and protection. The work they'd shared had created a partnership that went beyond mere convenience to encompass genuine collaboration between equals who respected each other's contributions and capabilities. Julien had asked for her opinions about ranch improvements, rather than assuming he knew best, while his suggestions had shown understanding of her goals and constraints, rather than dismissive impatience with her limited resources. The efficiency they'd achieved working together had demonstrated what was possible when two people combined their efforts toward common objectives, making solitary struggle seem like unnecessary martyrdom. The domestic routines they'd established had brought comfort that went beyond practical benefits to encompass emotional satisfaction she hadn't experienced since Thomas's death. Cooking for two people instead of one had made meals feel like celebrations rather than chores, while having someone to talk with during breakfast and dinner had restored rhythms of normal life that isolation had made impossible to maintain. Even simple activities like reading by the fire while he mended equipment had created an atmosphere of peaceful contentment that had been missing from her life for so long she'd forgotten what happiness felt like. The physical attraction that had developed gradually between them had been based on respect and affection rather than mere convenience or desperation, making it feel natural rather than like a betrayal of Thomas's memory. Julien's careful restraint and obvious consideration for her feelings had allowed her to explore new emotions at her own pace without pressure or demands that would have made her uncomfortable. The possibility of love had emerged slowly and organically from genuine compatibility rather than forced circumstances, making it seem like a gift rather than a compromise or settling for less than she deserved. But the stolen glances and brief touches that had marked their growing intimacy now seemed sinister in light of what she'd learned about his true identity, transforming tender moments into evidence of how completely she'd been manipulated by someone whose survival depended on gaining her trust and affection. The man whose presence had healed her loneliness was actually using her isolation and vulnerability to hide from justice, making her sanctuary into his hideout while she unknowingly provided cover for a killer whose crimes had left other women widowed and other families destroyed. As she struggled to reconcile the gentleman she'd come to care for with the murderer described on the wanted poster, Evangeline faced the heartbreaking realization that love built on lies was just another form of victimization, no matter how real her feelings had become. The moment of discovery had been so mundane that its significance hadn't registered immediately, just a piece of paper falling from Julien's coat pocket while she'd been mending a tear in the fabric, her eyes scanning the words automatically before their meaning penetrated her consciousness like a physical blow. The wanted poster was old and worn, suggesting he'd been carrying it for months, as either a reminder of his situation or a way to monitor how accurately his description was being circulated among law enforcement agencies. The fact that he'd kept such damning evidence so close to him revealed either dangerous carelessness or psychological need to maintain connection with his criminal past. The charges listed on the poster were specific and horrifying: 5 murders, including a sheriff, with details that painted a picture of deliberate violence rather than crimes of passion or self-defense. The dates and locations showed a pattern of movement across multiple territories, suggesting a career criminal rather than someone who'd made a single terrible mistake and fled the consequences. The substantial bounty reflected the seriousness with which territorial authorities viewed his crimes and their determination to see him brought to justice regardless of the cost or difficulty involved in his capture. The physical description matched Julien perfectly, down to specific scars and identifying marks that left no room for doubt about his identity, despite the time that had passed since the poster's creation. The name Julien Blackwood was probably false, but the details about his appearance were too accurate to belong to anyone else, making her complicity in harboring a fugitive an undeniable fact that could destroy her life even if he disappeared immediately. Her innocent kindness in helping an injured stranger had made her an accessory to multiple murders in the eyes of the law, a situation that could result in her own imprisonment or death, regardless of her ignorance about his true identity. The realization that she'd been living with a killer for 3 weeks, sharing meals and conversations and growing feelings of affection with someone whose hands had taken multiple lives, was almost too overwhelming to process rationally. Every moment of tenderness between them now seemed like evidence of her dangerous naivety and his manipulative skill, while every kindness he'd shown her appeared to be calculated behavior designed to ensure her continued cooperation in providing shelter and protection. The man she'd begun to love was a stranger whose very presence endangered her life and her future in ways she was only beginning to understand. The sound of his footsteps approaching the house had given her barely enough time to hide the evidence and compose her expression before he entered the kitchen, his familiar smile and casual greeting creating a surreal contrast between her new knowledge and his continued performance of the gentle stranger persona. As she looked into his eyes and saw nothing but warmth and affection, Evangeline realized that either he was a master of deception, whose acting skills rivaled those of professional performers, or the capacity for violence described on the wanted poster coexisted with genuine feelings that made him equally dangerous and impossible to simply dismiss. The choice she faced was no longer between helping a stranger and protecting herself. It was between love and justice, safety and loyalty, survival and honor, with her heart and her conscience pulling her in opposite directions, while time ran out for making a decision that would determine both their fates. The dinner they shared that evening was torture for Evangeline, every casual remark from Julien feeling like another layer of deception, while she struggled to maintain normal conversation despite the knowledge burning in her chest like swallowed fire. His easy smile and gentle questions about her day seemed designed to lull her into continued compliance, while his offers to help with evening chores felt like attempts to demonstrate his value as a partner in case she was beginning to doubt the wisdom of their arrangement. The domestic peace that had felt so natural just hours earlier now seemed like an elaborate performance designed to keep her compliant and unsuspecting. The wanted poster hidden in her apron pocket felt like it weighed 100 pounds as she moved around the kitchen, serving food and making conversation, while her mind raced through impossible options that offered no clear path forward. Turning him in would mean betraying someone who'd shown her nothing but kindness and respect, while protecting him would mean becoming an accomplice to murder and risking her own life when bounty hunters inevitably arrived looking for their quarry. The substantial reward could solve all her financial problems and secure her future, but claiming it would require destroying the first real happiness she'd found since Thomas's death. The possibility that Julien might be innocent despite the evidence seemed too hopeful to trust. But her heart insisted that the man she'd come to know couldn't be the cold-blooded killer described on the wanted poster. His gentleness with injured animals, his patience when teaching her unfamiliar tasks, his obvious pain when speaking about past losses, all of these suggested someone capable of deep feeling and moral complexity rather than the heartless murderer law enforcement was seeking. But innocence and guilt weren't mutually exclusive, and good people could do terrible things under circumstances that pushed them beyond their normal moral boundaries. The growing physical distance between them as the evening progressed revealed that something had changed in her behavior, despite her efforts to act normally, his questions becoming more probing and his attention more focused as he sensed her discomfort without understanding its cause. The natural ease that had characterized their interactions was disappearing under the weight of her secret knowledge, creating tension that would eventually force a confrontation neither of them was prepared to handle. The trust that had been building between them was dissolving with each forced smile and awkward silence, making their situation increasingly unstable and dangerous. As they prepared for bed in their separate rooms, Evangeline realized that sleeping under the same roof with a wanted killer would be impossible regardless of her feelings for the man she believed him to be beneath his criminal reputation. The night would bring either honest conversation that might resolve her doubts, confrontation that could turn violent, or desperate flight that would leave her alone again but alive to rebuild her shattered life. The choice could no longer be delayed, and whatever decision she made would transform both their futures in ways that couldn't be predicted or controlled. Tomorrow would bring truth, one way or another, with consequences that would echo through the rest of their lives. Dawn broke gray and cold as Evangeline sat at her kitchen table with the wanted poster spread before her. Her hands shaking as she waited for Julien to wake and discover that his carefully constructed deception had finally crumbled. The night had been sleepless torture, hours of pacing and planning that had produced no clear strategy for handling a situation that offered no good options for anyone involved. Her decision to confront him directly was born of desperation rather than wisdom, but continuing to pretend ignorance while sharing her home with a potential killer had become impossible to sustain. The sound of his bedroom door opening sent her heart racing as footsteps approached the kitchen, where she sat like a judge preparing to pronounce sentence on someone whose guilt remained uncertain despite damning evidence. When Julien appeared in the doorway with his usual morning smile, the contrast between his obvious affection and the brutal charges listed on the paper before her was so stark, it felt like living in two different realities simultaneously. His greeting died on his lips when he saw the wanted poster, his face going pale as recognition and resignation replaced warmth and hope in his expression. "You know," he said quietly, settling into the chair across from her with movements that seemed suddenly careful and controlled, as if he was preparing for violence or flight depending on her response to his admission. "I wondered when this moment would come. 3 weeks is longer than I've stayed anywhere since." He gestured toward the poster without finishing the sentence, his voice carrying exhaustion that went beyond physical fatigue to encompass spiritual weariness that spoke of months or years of running from consequences that never stopped pursuing him. The silence that followed stretched between them like a chasm too wide to bridge, filled with questions that had no safe answers and accusations that would destroy whatever remained of the trust they'd built together. Evangeline found herself studying his face for signs of the killer described in the charges, but all she saw was the man who'd chopped her firewood and mended her fences while recovering from wounds that might have been earned through violence against innocent people. The disconnect between the gentle stranger she'd come to care for and the murderer law enforcement was seeking was almost too large to encompass in a single human being. "Tell me it's not true," she whispered, her voice breaking with the weight of hope that was probably foolish but impossible to abandon completely. "Tell me there's been some mistake, that you're not the man they're looking for, that the poster is wrong about who you are. The plea was desperate and pathetic, but she needed to hear his denial even if she couldn't bring herself to believe it. The alternative, accepting that she'd fallen in love with someone whose hands were stained with other people's blood, was too devastating to face without giving him one last chance to offer an explanation that might redeem them both. Julien's confession came slowly and painfully, each word seeming to cost him physical effort as he revealed details about events that had transformed him from the man he'd been into the fugitive he'd become. "The poster is accurate about the facts," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper as he stared at his hands rather than meeting her eyes. "5 men are dead because of me, including Sheriff Coleman. But the circumstances, the reasons, those aren't printed on any wanted poster, and they wouldn't matter to a judge even if they were." His admission hit her like a physical blow, confirming her worst fears while hinting at complexities that the simple charges couldn't capture. The story that emerged painted a picture of revenge rather than random violence, justice sought through illegal means when legal channels had failed to address crimes that had destroyed everything he'd once valued and protected. "They killed my wife and daughter," he continued, his voice gaining strength as anger replaced shame in his tone. "Sarah and little Marie murdered because I'd testified against their leader in a cattle-rustling trial. The sheriff refused to investigate, said there wasn't enough evidence to pursue charges against men who had alibis and political connections. The law failed them, so I took justice into my own hands." The details of his campaign of vengeance were methodical and calculated, each killing planned and executed with precision that spoke of military training and careful preparation rather than crimes of passion or random violence. He'd tracked down every member of the gang responsible for his family's deaths, eliminating them one by one over the course of 2 years, while staying ahead of law enforcement that considered him a greater threat than the criminals he was hunting. The final confrontation with Sheriff Coleman had been inevitable, the corrupt lawman who'd protected his family's killers in exchange for bribes and political support. "I know what the poster says about me," Julien said, finally meeting her eyes with a direct gaze that held no apology for his actions. "And I know what decent people think about men who take the law into their own hands. But those 5 men murdered a woman and a 6-year-old child, and they would have continued killing with impunity if someone hadn't stopped them." "I'm not asking for forgiveness or understanding. I'm just telling you the truth so you can make your decision with complete information about who you've been harboring." The weight of his revelation settled over Evangeline like a burial shroud, forcing her to confront questions about justice, morality, and the price of vengeance that had no clear answers in the harsh realities of frontier life. The man sitting across from her was both a murderer and someone who'd sought justice for the most innocent victims imaginable, making him simultaneously dangerous and sympathetic in ways that defied simple moral categories. His honesty in revealing details that could only make his situation worse suggested either desperate hope for her understanding or resigned acceptance that their relationship was ending, regardless of what she chose to do with her knowledge. As she looked into his eyes and saw pain that matched her own, Evangeline realized that choosing between love and law would require her to decide not just what was legal, but what was right in a world where the two weren't always the same thing. The silence that followed Julien's confession stretched for what felt like hours, both of them trapped in a moment that would determine whether their growing love could survive the weight of truth that changed everything about their situation. Evangeline found herself torn between sympathy for his loss and horror at his response, understanding his pain while questioning the justice of revenge that had made him a killer regardless of his motivations. The man who'd lost his family deserved compassion, but the vigilante who'd taken 5 lives deserved consequences that she was uniquely positioned to ensure he received. The practical considerations were equally troubling. Harboring a known fugitive would make her an accessory to murder in the eyes of the law, while turning him in would mean betraying someone who'd trusted her with information that could get him hanged within weeks of his capture. The substantial bounty on his head could solve all her financial problems and secure her future. But claiming it would mean destroying the first genuine connection she'd felt with another person since Thomas's death. The choice between love and money felt selfish, but the choice between love and justice felt impossible to make with any certainty about which was right. The question of whether Julien represented a continued threat to her safety or to innocent people added another layer of complexity to her dilemma, because killers who'd acted once in violence might act again when circumstances demanded it. His gentle behavior during their weeks together suggested someone capable of controlling his violent impulses, but the systematic nature of his revenge campaign proved he could plan and execute deadly actions when he believed they were justified. The man who'd been so tender with injured animals and careful of her feelings might be capable of killing anyone who threatened his freedom or his newfound happiness. The moral arguments on both sides were compelling and contradictory, with her heart insisting that love based on understanding and shared pain was more important than abstract justice, while her conscience demanded that she consider her obligations to the families of his victims and to a society that depended on law enforcement to maintain order. The 5 men he'd killed might have deserved their deaths, but vigilante justice undermined the legal system that protected everyone from chaos and personal revenge. Her choice would be about more than their relationship. It would be about what kind of world she wanted to live in and what kind of person she wanted to be. As the day wore on with the tension of unresolved crisis hanging between them, Evangeline realized that whatever decision she made would transform her permanently in ways that couldn't be undone or forgotten. Choosing to protect him would make her an outlaw's woman, forever looking over her shoulder for bounty hunters and lawmen who would see her as an enemy of justice. Choosing to turn him in would make her a betrayer of love, someone who'd traded affection for money and safety while destroying the first real happiness she'd found since becoming a widow. The choice would define her character and her future in ways that would echo through the rest of her life, making the decision both urgent and impossible to rush without careful consideration of consequences that would affect them both forever. The arrival of Sheriff Morrison and his deputy 3 days after her discovery of Julien's true identity brought Evangeline's crisis to a head, forcing her to make immediate decisions about loyalty and justice, while the man she'd been protecting worked unsuspectingly in the barn just yards away from lawmen who would arrest him on sight. The sheriff's casual explanation that they were checking on isolated homesteads as part of a routine patrol sounded innocent enough, but his questions about strangers in the area and his careful attention to signs of recent activity around her ranch suggested a more specific purpose that made her blood run cold with fear. "We've had reports of suspicious activity in this area," Sheriff Morrison explained as he accepted her offer of coffee while studying her kitchen with the trained eye of someone looking for evidence of deception. "A wanted killer named Julien Blackwood was spotted in Broken Creek last week, and we're checking every ranch and homestead within 50 miles to make sure folks are staying safe. He's dangerous and desperate, and he wouldn't hesitate to hurt innocent people if he thought they were threatening his freedom." The irony of his warning was almost unbearable as she served coffee to men who were hunting the stranger whose gentleness had restored her faith in human kindness. The deputy's attention to the ranch's obvious improvements, repaired fences, a new roof section, properly organized livestock, created a timeline that would be difficult to explain without admitting to assistance from someone whose presence she wasn't supposed to acknowledge. Her claim that she'd hired temporary help from drifters passing through sounded weak even to her own ears, especially when combined with her obvious nervousness and the deputy's observation that the work quality suggested skilled labor rather than casual assistance from transient workers seeking food and shelter. The sound of splitting wood from behind the barn provided a steady rhythm that seemed to grow louder as the conversation continued. each strike of Julian's axe marking another second of borrowed time before his presence would be discovered, and their carefully maintained deception would collapse into violence and arrest. Sheriff Morrison's growing attention to the sounds of activity around the ranch suggested that he was beginning to suspect her innocent explanations weren't complete, while his casual questions about her recent visitors and their descriptions were clearly attempts to gather information that would confirm or deny his suspicions about her involvement with their fugitive. The moment of decision arrived when Sheriff Morrison asked to look around the property, just to make sure everything is secure, his request carrying the weight of authority that made refusal seem suspicious, while compliance would inevitably lead to Julian's discovery and capture. As she weighed her options with seconds to make a choice that would determine both their fates, Evangeline realized that her comfortable neutrality was ending whether she wanted it to or not. The time had come to choose between law and love, safety and loyalty, her peaceful future and the man who'd given her a reason to believe in happiness again. The next words out of her mouth would make her either a hero or an accomplice, with no middle ground possible in a situation that demanded complete commitment to one side or the other. The decision to warn Julian came in a moment of pure instinct that bypassed rational thought, her heart making the choice her mind couldn't resolve as she excused herself to fetch fresh coffee and slipped out the back door toward the barn where the sound of splitting wood had fallen ominously silent. She found him already alert and watching the house through a crack in the barn wall, his stillness and focused attention indicating that he'd heard the horses and recognized the danger they represented long before she'd found the courage to defy law enforcement for his sake. "Lawmen," she whispered urgently, her voice barely audible even in the enclosed space of the barn where they stood close enough to touch while the weight of their impossible situation pressed down on them like a physical force. "Sheriff Morrison and a deputy. They're asking about strangers in the area, about you specifically. They want to search the property." Her warning was delivered with the breathless urgency of someone who'd just committed herself to a course of action that would change everything about her life, making her a criminal in the eyes of the law and a traitor to the community that had always considered her one of their most respectable citizens. Julian's response was immediate and efficient, his transformation from gentle ranch hand to dangerous fugitive happening in seconds as he gathered his few possessions and checked his weapons with movements that spoke of practiced preparation for exactly this kind of emergency. "Thank you," he said quietly, his eyes holding depths of gratitude and regret that encompassed both appreciation for her warning and sorrow for the danger he'd brought to her peaceful life. "This makes you a criminal too. You know that, don't you? Helping me escape will put a price on your head as well." The kiss they shared was desperate and final, a moment of connection that acknowledged their love while accepting that it couldn't survive the realities of their situation. His lips were warm and soft against hers, but his body was already tensing for flight, and she could feel him pulling away emotionally, even as he held her close physically. The tenderness between them was real and precious, but it was being consumed by circumstances that made their feelings irrelevant to the practical demands of survival that would separate them permanently within minutes. "I'll head north toward the mountains," he said, as he prepared to slip out the barn's back entrance into terrain that would hide his escape route from pursuing lawmen. "If they ask, tell them you never saw me. Lie convincingly, because your life depends on it now." His instructions were practical and necessary. But they also marked the end of their brief happiness together and the beginning of a new chapter in both their lives that would be defined by his status as fugitive and her role as the woman who'd chosen love over law. As he disappeared into the trees behind her ranch, Evangeline returned to the house to face Sheriff Morrison's questions with lies that would either save them both or damn her as an accomplice to the crimes that had made the man she loved a wanted killer with a bounty on his head that someone would eventually claim. The performance Evangeline gave for Sheriff Morrison and his deputy was the most convincing acting of her life. her desperation to protect Julien, transforming her natural honesty into practiced deception that would have impressed professional criminals. She answered their questions with steady voice and direct eye contact, describing the ranch improvements as her own work accomplished over months rather than weeks, while dismissing the sounds they'd heard as cattle movement and wind rattling loose boards in aging buildings. Her lies were detailed enough to be believable, but simple enough to remember consistently if questioned again later. The search of her property that followed was thorough, but ultimately futile, with the lawmen finding evidence of recent activity, but no trace of the man who'd caused it since Julien had been too careful to leave obvious signs of his extended presence. His few possessions had been removed when he fled, while the work he'd completed could have been done by anyone with basic construction skills and adequate time. Sheriff Morrison's suspicions remained, but suspicion without proof was worthless in territorial courts that required evidence to support accusations of harboring fugitives. The deputy's discovery of boot prints near the barn that didn't match her smaller feet created a moment of tension that threatened to expose her deception, but her explanation that hired hands had helped with recent repairs seemed to satisfy their curiosity without prompting deeper investigation. The prints were already weathered enough to suggest age rather than recent activity, while the lack of personal belongings or other evidence of current occupation made it impossible to prove that anyone had been living on her property rather than simply working there temporarily. The conversation that concluded their visit carried subtle warnings about the dangers of helping wanted criminals, with Sheriff Morrison's advice about reporting suspicious activity delivered in tones that suggested he suspected her involvement but couldn't prove it. His promise to return if they received additional reports about fugitive activity in the area was both threat and warning, making it clear that her performance had been adequate but not entirely convincing. She was being watched now, her innocent reputation replaced by suspicion that would make future deception more difficult and dangerous. As the lawmen rode away from her ranch, Evangeline felt the weight of her choice settling over her like a heavy cloak that would be impossible to remove regardless of how the situation ultimately resolved. She'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, transforming herself from law-abiding citizen to criminal accomplice in the space of a single conversation filled with lies and misdirection. The woman who'd always prided herself on honesty and integrity had become someone who could lie convincingly to representatives of the law, and the change felt both necessary and damning. Her love for Julien had saved his life but compromised her soul, making her question whether the choice had been heroic or simply another form of victimization by someone whose very presence had forced impossible decisions on an innocent woman who'd only wanted to help a stranger in need. The weeks that followed Julien's flight were torture for Evangeline, each day bringing anxiety about whether he'd been captured, killed, or simply moved on to seek safety, far away from the woman whose warning had saved his life, but whose continued association would endanger them both. The silence from the outside world was simultaneously reassuring and terrifying. No news might mean he was safe, but it could equally mean his death had gone unreported, or that his capture was being kept secret to avoid revealing how law enforcement had been tracking his movements through her ranch. The routine of daily life became a form of penance as she threw herself into ranch work with desperate intensity, using physical exhaustion to quiet the emotional turmoil that threatened to consume her rational thought. The improvements Julien had made during his stay were constant reminders of his presence and the choices she'd made to protect him, while the work that remained undone highlighted how much she'd come to depend on his assistance in ways that went beyond mere physical labor to encompass companionship and emotional support that she might never find again. The isolation that had been bearable during the weeks of sharing her home with someone who understood and appreciated her company now felt like punishment for her criminal behavior, with every sunset marking another day of uncertainty about Julien's fate and her own future. The guilty knowledge of her involvement in his escape created barriers between herself and neighbors, who continued to treat her with friendly respect while remaining ignorant of her transformation from innocent widow to accomplice in harboring a wanted killer whose crimes included multiple murders. The paranoia that came with her new status as criminal made every visitor a potential threat, with casual social calls from neighbors feeling like interrogations designed to discover evidence of her illegal activity. Sheriff Morrison's promised return visits never materialized, but the threat of renewed investigation hung over every interaction with authority figures who might recognize signs of deception in her behavior or discover evidence she'd overlooked in her efforts to eliminate traces of Julian's extended presence on her property. The dreams that plagued her sleep were filled with images of Julian being captured, tried, and executed, while she remained powerless to help him further. Her warning having provided only temporary salvation rather than permanent escape from justice that would inevitably claim him regardless of how far he ran or how well he hid. The nightmares were balanced by fantasies of his successful escape to California or Mexico, where he could build a new life under a different identity, but hope felt like self-delusion when weighed against the resources and determination of territorial law enforcement that considered him a priority target worthy of sustained pursuit across multiple jurisdictions. The message arrived on a rainy evening 6 weeks after Julian's disappearance, delivered by a traveling merchant who claimed a stranger had paid him to ensure its delivery to the widow at the Dufresne ranch, without providing additional details about its origin or contents. The envelope was unmarked except for her name, written in handwriting she recognized immediately, causing her heart to race with relief and terror as she realized that Julian was alive and had found a way to contact her despite the dangers such communication created for them both. The letter itself was brief and carefully worded to avoid specific references that might incriminate her if it was intercepted by law enforcement, but its meaning was clear to someone who understood the context of their relationship and the circumstances of his departure. I am well and safe in a place where winter comes early and stays long. The work is hard but honest, and I think often of the kindness shown to a stranger who needed healing more than he deserved. My wounds have mended completely, and I am strong enough now to face whatever challenges come. I hope the same is true for you. The coded language spoke of survival and employment in mountain territory, where seasonal isolation would provide protection from pursuit. The poem included with the letter was obviously his own composition, filled with imagery that referenced their shared experiences while expressing emotions that couldn't be stated directly in correspondence that might be discovered by hostile authorities. The verses about morning coffee shared in warm kitchens and evening conversations by firelight carried intimate meaning that no outsider could interpret, while his promises of eternal gratitude for sanctuary offered by an angel of mercy revealed depths of feeling that had survived their forced separation. The poetry was both love letter and goodbye, acknowledging their connection while accepting its impossibility. The final paragraph contained the most dangerous and precious information: coordinates for a mountain cabin where he would wait for 1 week each month, hoping she might find a way to join him if her feelings had survived the revelation of his true identity and the consequences of choosing to protect him. The offer was presented as invitation rather than expectation, acknowledging that coming to him would require abandoning everything she'd built in favor of a life as fugitive's woman that would mean permanent exile from respectable society and constant danger from bounty hunters seeking the substantial reward for his capture. As she read the letter for the dozenth time, memorizing every word before burning it to prevent discovery by anyone who might use it against them, Evangeline faced the most important decision of her life. Julian was offering her a chance to share his exile, to build something real and lasting despite the dangers and hardships such a choice would entail. But accepting his invitation would mean leaving behind her ranch, her identity, and her dreams of returning to normal life in favor of an uncertain future with a man whose past would always make them targets for violence. The choice between safety and love had returned, but this time it would be final and irreversible, determining not just their immediate fate, but the entire trajectory of whatever life remained to them. The journey north toward the mountains began 3 weeks after receiving Julien's letter, with Evangeline's preparations disguised as normal ranch business to avoid arousing suspicion among neighbors who might report unusual activity to authorities still investigating fugitive sightings in the region. She sold her cattle to buyers in the next county, claiming financial necessity rather than plans for permanent departure, while storing valuable possessions with friends who believed she was visiting relatives in Colorado rather than fleeing territorial jurisdiction to join a wanted killer in voluntary exile. The provisions she gathered for what she described as an extended hunting trip included supplies for extended wilderness survival, with weapons, medical supplies, and preserved food that would sustain 2 people through mountain winter if necessary. Her cover story about hunting elk in high country, where game was abundant and competition minimal, seemed reasonable to neighbors who knew her late husband had taught her wilderness skills before his death, making her solo expedition seem adventurous rather than suspicious or dangerous to people who'd grown accustomed to her independent behavior. The emotional weight of leaving behind everything Thomas had built during their marriage was almost unbearable, with each familiar object and treasured memory becoming a source of guilt about abandoning his legacy for love of someone whose criminal past would have horrified the law-abiding man she'd married. But the alternative, spending the rest of her life alone while knowing that happiness was possible with someone who understood and valued her, seemed like a betrayal of different but equally important values about the purpose and meaning of human connection in harsh frontier conditions. The letter she left for her father explaining her decision was carefully crafted to reveal enough truth to prevent unnecessary searches, while protecting both Julien and herself from legal consequences that would follow if authorities understood her true destination and purpose. Her claim that she was traveling east to care for dying relatives would eventually be exposed as false, but the deception would provide time for them to establish themselves in territory where territorial jurisdiction was unclear and federal authority was limited by practical considerations about cost and difficulty of pursuit. The final night in the cabin where she'd shared such brief happiness with Julien was spent in prayer and reflection about choices that had brought her to this moment of absolute commitment to a future that offered no guarantees beyond shared danger and uncertain survival. The woman who'd once been afraid to live without community approval was preparing to embrace outlaw status for love of someone whose protection had already transformed her into a criminal in the eyes of law enforcement. As dawn broke over the ranch, she was abandoning forever. Evangeline loaded her horse with supplies for a journey that would either end in reunion with the man she loved or death in wilderness that showed no mercy to travelers who made mistakes or encountered dangers beyond their ability to survive alone. The cabin Julien had described in his letter was exactly where his coordinates had indicated, hidden in a valley so remote that discovery would require either deliberate search or extraordinary bad luck for anyone seeking to avoid human contact. The structure was small but well built, with improvements that spoke of careful planning and skilled labor invested in creating a refuge that could sustain 2 people through harsh mountain winters while remaining invisible to casual travelers or hunting parties that might report its location to authorities seeking fugitives in the region. Evangeline's arrival after 4 days of difficult travel through terrain that tested both her wilderness skills and her determination was greeted with joy and relief that made every hardship of the journey seem worthwhile. Julien's embrace was fierce and desperate, holding her as if she might disappear if he relaxed his grip, while his whispered words of gratitude and love confirmed that their separation had been as painful for him as it had been for her. The reunion was everything she'd hoped and more, validating her choice to abandon safety for love despite the enormous risks such a decision had entailed. The life they built together in their mountain hideaway was harder but more fulfilling than anything either had experienced in conventional society, with daily survival requiring cooperation and mutual dependence that created bonds stronger than mere romantic attraction. The isolation that might have been crushing for people accustomed to community interaction became precious sanctuary for two who'd learned that society's approval came with conditions they couldn't accept. Their love was tested by constant challenges but strengthened by shared struggle against elements that cared nothing for human comfort or convenience. The practical aspects of their exile were demanding but manageable, with Julien's skills as hunter and builder complemented by Evangeline's knowledge of food preservation and medical care that had been essential for frontier survival even in more civilized circumstances. They developed routines and systems that maximized their chances of surviving weather, wildlife, and accidents that could be fatal for people too far from help to expect rescue from outside sources. Their competence in handling wilderness dangers grew through necessity and practice that no formal education could have provided. But the emotional rewards of their partnership went beyond mere survival to encompass fulfillment and happiness that neither had imagined possible when their relationship had begun under such difficult circumstances. The trust required for their daily survival created intimacy that exceeded anything either had experienced in previous relationships, while their shared outlaw status eliminated pretense and social conventions that had constrained their ability to be completely honest with each other. The freedom to be themselves without apology or explanation was worth the price they'd paid for it, making their exile feel like liberation rather than punishment for choices that society couldn't understand or forgive. The news that federal marshals had joined the hunt for Julien Blackwood reached their mountain refuge through a fur trapper whose loose tongue revealed information that made their sanctuary feel suddenly vulnerable to discovery and attack. The involvement of federal authorities transformed a territorial manhunt into a national priority, with resources and jurisdiction that made their isolation less protective than it had seemed when they were only avoiding local law enforcement with limited range and authority. The stakes had escalated beyond anything they'd prepared for when choosing exile over separation. The trapper's description of systematic searches being conducted throughout the mountain regions included enough detail about methods and locations to make it clear that their pursuit was being coordinated by professionals with experience tracking fugitives in wilderness conditions. The federal marshals weren't simply following random tips and hoping for luck. They were conducting methodical sweeps that would eventually cover every valley and cabin where a fugitive might find shelter, making discovery a matter of time rather than chance unless they took drastic action to protect themselves. The bounty on Julien's head had been increased to attract more hunters and informants, with the substantial reward now large enough to motivate private citizens to join the search, despite the dangers involved in pursuing a known killer. The network of eyes and ears looking for signs of his presence had expanded beyond law enforcement to include merchants, trappers, and settlers whose financial interests made them allies of justice rather than neutral observers of events that didn't directly concern them. Their isolation was becoming an illusion that provided false security, while real danger closed around them. The psychological pressure of knowing they were being hunted was almost as difficult to endure as the practical challenges of avoiding capture, with every sound outside their cabin creating anxiety about whether discovery was imminent. Sleep became difficult, when any noise might signal the approach of armed men whose orders were to bring Julien back dead or alive, while daily activities had to be planned around staying hidden from observers who might be anywhere in the surrounding wilderness. The peace they'd found in their mountain refuge was being poisoned by constant vigilance that made normal life impossible to maintain. The decision about whether to flee deeper into the wilderness or make a stand in the cabin they'd learned to call home had to be made quickly, before the search reached their valley and eliminated their options for escape or effective resistance. Running would mean abandoning everything they'd built together while risking exposure during travel through unfamiliar territory, but staying would mean facing professional manhunters whose training and equipment gave them overwhelming advantages in any direct confrontation. Either choice carried enormous risks that could result in death or separation, making their next decision potentially the last they would ever make together. The confrontation came at dawn on a morning when frost turned their valley into a glittering wonderland that seemed too beautiful to become a battlefield, with 3 federal marshals approaching their cabin through terrain they'd studied for days before making their move. Julian's warning system of carefully placed mirrors and string alarms had given them enough notice to prepare for the encounter. But preparation couldn't overcome the reality that they were outnumbered by professionals whose training and legal authority made resistance seem futile despite their determination to stay together regardless of the cost. The marshals' demand for surrender was delivered with professional courtesy that acknowledged both Julian's reputation for violence and Evangeline's status as potentially innocent victim rather than willing accomplice, offering her safe passage in exchange for stepping aside while they arrested the man she'd risked everything to protect. Their assumption that she would choose self-preservation over loyalty to a known killer revealed how little they understood about the bonds that had been forged through shared hardship and mutual dependence in circumstances that tested character more thoroughly than any courtroom trial ever could. Evangeline's decision to stand with Julian, despite the marshal's offer of clemency, was delivered with quiet dignity that impressed even the lawmen who'd come to arrest them, her refusal to abandon the man she loved, marking her transformation from innocent widow to outlaw's woman who'd found her true identity through choosing love over safety. Her words about having made her choice months earlier and living with the consequences regardless of what happened next carried the ring of absolute conviction that couldn't be shaken by threats or promises from authorities who represented a world she'd rejected permanently. The gunfight that followed was brief but decisive, with Julian's superior knowledge of local terrain and Evangeline's unexpected competence with weapons combining to overcome the marshals' advantages in training and equipment. The conflict was settled not by superior marksmanship, but by desperate courage and intimate familiarity with defensive positions that had been prepared for exactly this kind of confrontation. When the shooting stopped, 3 federal marshals lay dead in the snow, while the fugitives they'd come to arrest stood victorious, but forever changed by violence that had crossed a line from which there could be no return. The aftermath of their victory was sobering rather than celebratory, with both understanding that killing federal officers had made them enemies of the entire government rather than mere territorial fugitives whose crimes might eventually be forgotten or forgiven. Their sanctuary had become a crime scene that would bring additional waves of law enforcement seeking to avenge fallen comrades and uphold federal authority that couldn't tolerate such defiance without massive retaliation. The love that had saved them from capture had also doomed them to permanent exile from civilization, making their mountain refuge both fortress and prison for the rest of whatever life remained to them as enemies of the state whose crimes could never be pardoned or overlooked. The burial of the 3 federal marshals in the frozen ground behind their cabin was somber work that marked their complete transformation from law-abiding citizens to enemies of the state whose survival depended on remaining hidden from a government that would never stop hunting them. Each grave they dug was a reminder that their love had been purchased with other people's lives, making their happiness feel tainted by violence they couldn't undo or justify, beyond the simple fact that protecting each other had required killing anyone who threatened their freedom to stay together. The letters they found among the marshals' possessions revealed the scope of federal determination to capture Julien Blackwood, with orders that authorized unlimited resources and jurisdiction to pursue him across territorial boundaries until he was brought to justice. The discovery that Evangeline had been identified as willing accomplice rather than innocent victim meant that she was now equally wanted by authorities who considered her betrayal of law enforcement more serious than simple harboring of fugitives. Their shared outlaw status was official and permanent, eliminating any possibility of negotiated surrender or clemency that might have allowed one of them to return to normal life. The practical preparations for deeper exile included destroying evidence of their presence in the valley while gathering supplies for indefinite travel through wilderness, where survival would depend entirely on their own skills and resources. The cabin that had been their sanctuary for months had to be abandoned, along with possessions that couldn't be carried on horseback through terrain that offered concealment, but little comfort for travelers whose margin for error was measured in hours rather than days. Every decision about what to take and what to leave behind was potentially a choice between life and death in circumstances where wrong choices would have fatal consequences. The emotional weight of accepting that they would never again live normal lives among civilized people was balanced by gratitude for love that had proven strong enough to survive every test that circumstances had imposed on their relationship. Their bond had been forged through shared danger and mutual sacrifice that created intimacy beyond anything either had experienced in conventional relationships constrained by social expectations and legal obligations. The freedom to be completely honest with each other about their fears, hopes, and desires was compensation for the isolation that would define the rest of their lives together. As they prepared to leave the valley where they'd found happiness despite the dangers that had pursued them there, both understood that their love had transformed them into people they barely recognized from their former selves. The widow who'd once craved community approval had become someone who could kill federal officers without hesitation when protecting the man she loved, while the vengeful killer who'd thought himself incapable of peace had found redemption through someone whose love had made him want to be better than his worst actions. Their exile would continue indefinitely, but they would face it together as partners whose commitment had been tested by everything the world could throw at them and had emerged stronger rather than broken by trials that would have destroyed weaker bonds. 5 years after their flight from the valley, where they'd killed 3 federal marshals, Julien and Evangeline had built a new life in the Canadian wilderness, where territorial jurisdiction was unclear and federal authority was limited by practical considerations about cost and difficulty of pursuing fugitives across international boundaries. Their small homestead in the remote forests of British Columbia was isolated enough to provide security, while productive enough to sustain them through careful farming and hunting that required no contact with civilization except for occasional trading with fur trappers who asked no questions about their customers' backgrounds or reasons for seeking such extreme isolation. The peace they'd found in their northern exile was deeper and more complete than anything either had experienced during their previous lives, with daily routines centered around survival and partnership, rather than conformity to social expectations that had never truly fit their characters or circumstances. Their love had matured through shared hardship into something that transcended romance to encompass complete interdependence and mutual understanding that made them stronger together than either could have been alone. The trials that had driven them from civilization had ultimately freed them to become their truest selves, without apology or compromise. The news that reached them through occasional visitors spoke of changes in territorial law enforcement that had reduced the intensity of their pursuit, as new crises demanded attention and resources that could no longer be devoted to hunting fugitives whose crimes were increasingly forgotten by public officials dealing with more immediate concerns. The federal marshals who'd replaced those they'd killed had been assigned to other cases, while local authorities had accepted that some criminals simply disappeared into wilderness too vast and dangerous for sustained pursuit by lawmen whose primary responsibility was protecting settled communities rather than pursuing abstract justice in remote territories. The children they'd raised in their mountain sanctuary had grown into young adults whose wilderness skills and independence would have impressed professional scouts, while their education in practical knowledge and moral philosophy had prepared them for lives that would be different from, but not inferior to, those available in conventional society. Their family had thrived in conditions that would have destroyed people dependent on external support, proving that love and determination could create happiness even in circumstances that others would consider impossible hardship. The letter that arrived with a fur trader in their 5th year of exile brought news that changed everything about their legal status. A federal pardon signed by a president whose administration had decided that pursuit of aging fugitives was less important than reconciliation policies designed to heal divisions created by territorial conflicts that had claimed too many lives on all sides. The document declared amnesty for certain categories of crimes committed during periods of social upheaval, including vigilante justice sought by citizens who'd been failed by corrupt or inadequate law enforcement. Julien Blackwood was officially forgiven for his crimes, while Evangeline Dufresne was absolved of any complicity in harboring fugitives or resisting federal authority. Their freedom to return to civilization was complete and unconditional, but the choice to remain in their wilderness paradise was equally clear and unanimous. The life they'd built together through love and sacrifice was more precious than any comfort or convenience that society could offer, while their children's happiness in the only home they'd ever known made departure seem like abandonment of everything valuable they'd created through years of shared struggle. The widow who'd taken in a stranger and learned he was a wanted killer had discovered that love beyond the law was stronger than any legal authority, more lasting than any social approval, and more rewarding than any conventional happiness. They had chosen each other over everything else the world could offer, and the choice had proven to be the best decision of their lives, creating a legacy of love that would endure long after their names were forgotten and their crimes had become nothing more than footnotes in territorial history that recorded the price and power of love that refused to be conquered by any force on earth.